and welcome to the 2018 Cushwa Center Lecture. My name is Kathy Cummings. I'm the director of the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism and a faculty member in the Departments of American Studies and History here at Notre Dame. It's wonderful, as always, to see so many friends of the Cushwa Center, so many regulars, but I'm equally pleased to be able to welcome those of you who are joining us for the first time this afternoon. You're very welcome. Since Martin Marty delivered the first Cushwa Center lecture in 1984, this series has provided an opportunity for the Notre Dame community to hear from some of the most renowned scholars and public intellectuals from across the country on topics related to religion and public life. And I'm especially delighted to welcome this year's speaker, Marie Griffith, the John C. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where she directs the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. Marie's research interests include religion, gender, and American politics. She received her PhD in religion from Harvard University and held postdoctoral fellowships at Princeton and Northwestern University before joining the Princeton faculty as Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion. She was promoted to full professor there in 2005. During her time at Princeton, Marie directed the Women and Gender Studies program, and she received the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching, as well as the Kotzen Fellowship for Distinguished Teaching. She spent 2 years at Harvard University as the John A. Bartlett Professor before moving to Washington University in 2011. Marie's first major publication was God's Daughters, Evangelical Women and the Power of Submission, that appeared in 1997. And that examines the practices and perceptions of contemporary evangelical women. And while she was writing that book, we were just reminiscing about the Cushwa Center's Engendering American Catholicism Conference, which took place in 1995, where we met for the first time, and that was so pivotal for so many of us as we were thinking about gender and religion. Marie's book, Born Again Bodies, Flesh and Spirit in American Christianity, appeared in 2004, and that explored the history of Christian-influenced attitudes and practices related to the evangelical diet and fitness movement. And of course, her latest book, Moral Combat, How Sex Divided American Christians and Fractured American Politics, was published last December. Copies of that book, as well as her previous ones, are on sale just outside this room, and thanks to the Notre Dame bookstore, they'll be available for sale, and I believe Marie would be happy to sign some copies. I've never had an author refuse to sign copies of her book, so we'll look forward to that. Marie's last visit to the Cushwa Center was in April 2008 as a speaker at the Center's Catholicism in the American Century Conference. Tim Matavina, who's here today, was the director of the Cushwa Center at that time. And Marie contributed a chapter to a Cornell University Press volume that emerged from that conference called Catholics in the American Century, Recasting Narratives of U.S. History. And it was a very important chapter on gender, sexuality, and historiography. We're very lucky to have Marie with us for several days this week. On Saturday morning, she will serve as commentator at the Seminar in American Religion on David Hollinger's new book, Protestants Abroad, How Missionaries Tried to Change the World, but Changed America. So we hope many of you will join us again then, and please see me or another Cushwa Center staff member for more information. For right now, though, please join me in welcoming Professor Marie Griffith.
Thank you so much, Kathy. It's truly an honor for me to be invited to deliver this lecture. And Kathy has been a generous and wonderful colleague to me for many years, and I'm happy to see other friends and colleagues that I've known going all the way back to our first year of college in one particular case. So also thank you to Madonna Nowak for all the logistical assistance that she gave for my trip. I'm honored especially to be invited to speak at such a renowned Catholic institution about some very difficult issues that have roiled your church no less than my own. I'm a Protestant and a member of the Episcopal Church, which split over some of the issues that I'm about to discuss today. So we'll have time for discussion at the end, and I think there's a lot to discuss. So let me take you back to June of 2015 when the U.S. Supreme Court released its 5-4 decision in Obergefell v. Hodges. You'll remember this is the decision that found a constitutional right to civil marriage for same-sex couples. It also released 4 dissenting opinions, separate opinions from each justice on the dissenting side, which is quite remarkable. And of course, you all remember that the nation was as polarized as the court itself. While progressives and liberals across the 50 states celebrated the outcome as a long overdue affirmation of equality for gay men and lesbians, many conservatives and most conservative religious leaders condemned the decision. One called it the emotional terrorism of the left, sort of credited that, and have identified it as a dire blow to religious liberty and the nation's welfare. Others have called it a deadly insult to biblical teachings that supposedly give instructions on human sexuality that are eternal and divine. So anger over that Obergefell decision remains, and it utterly divides progressive Christians who wholeheartedly affirm LGBTQ people in the fullness of their lives, and I mean Catholic and Protestant progressives alike, from their more conservative Catholic and evangelical counterparts who believe same-sex activity is simply sinful, sadly enough, and must not be condoned. And this matches the broader divides in the nation. Now, this conflict corresponds, as you know, with others in the recent culture wars. For instance, just in the few years since the turn of the 21st century, some Christian leaders have blamed feminism and the nation's growing acceptance of homosexuality for the 9/11 terrorist attacks, for the theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado, for the Sandy Hook elementary school shooting, and more and more and more. Over and over again, America's acceptance of feminism, sexual depravity, and various types of sexual immorality, as they see it, have been held liable for horrific acts of violence that God has ostensibly refused to prevent. An assumption that turns resistors like Kim Davis and jurists like Clarence Thomas into heroes. So my question has been, why these particular issues? Where have they been, and why have they been so salient and so fierce? Sexual purity, meaning virginity before marriage and nothing but celibacy outside of it, seems like such a political obsession in our culture, not just something that families care about or churches care about, but something that is deeply political and public in our culture, and also seems like the very core of our polarization. I mean, there are a lot of other things that Christians care about that could gain this kind of traction: poverty, world hunger, mass incarceration, the permanent, in some cases, family separations at the nation's borders, etc. And Christians care about all of those issues, of course, across the board. But those issues have not gotten nearly the same political traction and passionate emotional following among the American people as issues relating to women, gender, and sex. So my point isn't that Christian leaders and people don't care. Of course they care. William Barber, Cardinal DiNardo, I mean, there's been condemnation of these things all along, but they don't get politicized and get the same political traction. So the historian's question is, why and how did all of this happen? And to really comprehend how we got to this divisive culture war over sexuality, I think we have to understand the long religious interest and preoccupation with sex and how it has shaped subsequent American political debates over women's rights, gender roles, and sexual mores. And of course, this preoccupation emerges out of the long history of church debates, as numerous historians of early and medieval Christianity have shown, and has been made all the more powerful by entrenched notions that Christian morality should provide the basis for our nation's law and politics. Now, certainly religious leaders outside Christianity have also been involved, often deeply, in these great moral debates. But for most of U.S. history until quite recently, Christians, of course, played a dominant role in American policymaking, and they have also predominated as those most vigorously mixing sex and politics and waging the most passionate battles in this arena. And really, by the time Obergefell came down in 2015, I think you could say that the rupture between Christian antagonists in this broader culture war felt irremediable. One could plausibly argue that American Christianity had flat out split into two oppositional religions. No longer Protestant versus Catholic, as there was a long history of that kind of opposition, but something else. We could call it pro-feminism versus anti-feminism. I would put abortion to the side here because there are, of course, many feminist anti-abortion positions that confound that divide. But still, this sort of generalization of two distinct and even oppositional Christianities seems to hold on nearly all gender-related issues. And for people who are members of faith communities, there's a true tragedy in that. Now, I believe it's possible to empirically try to trace this out and to trace out a steady breakdown since the early 20th century of a one-time Christian consensus about sexual morality and gender roles, and to trace out the battles over sex and gender between different groups of Christians and between some groups of Christians and more secularists and others that have resulted. So I think of it this way: up through the end of the 19th century, whatever else Americans disagreed about, slavery, immigration, and much else, most Americans believed in and took for granted as natural a sexual order in which men were heads of households, wives must submit to husband's authority, and monogamous heterosexual marriage was the only sanctioned site for sexual relations. This was simply God's law. Those who broke the rules were punished or shunned. And it was really the modern women's rights movement, and above all, the push for women's right to an equal vote on par with men, that prompted a crisis for those shared assumptions that would lead steadily to deep cleavages in our politics that have only deepened over time. So just to go back to that, it was August of 1920, after decades of hard work, that women won the legal right to vote in all state and national elections. But that victory, of course, far from being universally celebrated, roused further determination among those who, for various reasons, resisted women's equality. There had always been antagonism to women voting from some factions. There were arguments at the time that granting women full citizenship would damage their reproductive organs and threaten the sacred role of mother to which women were born. This kind of specter that something about women's equality would damage women and really destroy women. Women would no longer want to be mothers, want to be wives, want to be responsible citizens, was a very rife fear at the time. And that opposition to women's suffrage included a great number of women, too. Conservative Protestant and Catholic women who believed truly terrible changes would result from female suffrage. And of course, the greatest hostility came from the Jim Crow South, with the fear that if you extended the vote to white women, black women would follow. So post-suffrage efforts to return to and reinforce the old order took place on many, many fronts, but none were more vigorous or enduring than the endeavors that were focused explicitly on reproduction, motherhood, and sex. And later debates ranging from birth control to same-sex marriage spring from these same seeds, with many religious conservatives perceiving injury to their own religious rights, their own religious freedom, produced by gains in gender and sexual rights, of which they deeply disapprove. And so we've sort of created a public discourse that almost, and I think very dangerously, assumes that Americans, religious and secular alike, somehow have to take sides in a fight between gender and sexuality rights on the one side and religious rights on the other, that these are somehow at odds with each other. And we have to reckon with the consequences of that. So in short, the intermixing of religion, sex, and politics took on a very particular urgency after the failure of the anti-suffrage efforts in 1920. And the urgency for Americans on all sides of these debates has only escalated through the decades. So I today want to talk about 3 examples in particular of many more. So first, the achievement of women's suffrage boosted the momentum of another significant movement, which was the push for access to information about birth control. The birth control movement, which first arose in the mid-1910s among free-thinking radicals and social reformers in New York, of course, generated fierce controversy and debate that has stretched over decades. While the success of women's suffrage helped it gradually to attain some measure of respectability in the 1920s, the religious opposition to contraceptive access increasingly mobilized to try and halt the movement. But by the early 1930s, the Christian consensus on sex that had framed the nation's morals prior to this time, again, had markedly fractured. And advocacy for contraception within marriage was increasingly viewed by ecumenical Protestants as morally acceptable and perfectly in harmony with American liberty. This was a change because Protestant Christians campaigning against vice and immorality had for decades worked to restrict access to contraception. None was more successful, of course, than Anthony Comstock. Comstock was a Civil War veteran for the Union side. He was a pious Protestant with ties to the YMCA. And in 1873, he founded the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which was dedicated to suppressing particular kinds of materials that were deemed obscene, including, and this is a quote, any article whatever for the prevention of conception or for causing abortion. And of course, the federal Comstock law that was passed that same year, 1873, made this the law across the land, while many states also passed their own anti-obscenity laws as well. So after 1873, many states punished people who received information about contraception as strenuously even as those who disseminated it. So the success of Comstock and his allied Protestant leaders was truly vast and illustrated again that broad Christian consensus regarding concepts of sexual vice and immorality and the need to legally constrain such things. The efforts to legalize contraceptive access then gained momentum largely through the work of radicals such as, most famously, Margaret Sanger, who eventually became the movement's major leader. Sanger was a nurse midwife who had been galvanized by her early public health work in the immigrant ghettos of New York. Throughout her life, she worked to promote a movement for birth control, which she deeply believed to be a just, humane, and noble cause. Comstock and Sanger fought one another. Comstock made sure she was indicted for indecency and arrested, and that only stopped with his sudden death in the midst of their legal battles. Over the next few years, Sanger was very savvy and realized the need to build coalitions and to appeal to broad factions of people in order to build strength for the movement. And as she grew increasingly pragmatic, she worked especially with liberal Protestant clergy behind the scenes to persuade them of the justice of her cause. And quite quickly, actually, the New York papers and national magazines like Harper's and Current Opinion published sympathetic pieces that treated contraception as a scientific issue. And of course, they looked at different questions relating to it, from eugenic improvement, so-called, to public health, women's rights, lots of different angles and lots of different types of factions of people who were allied on that issue. Now, of course, not all the attention was sympathetic. Her influence prompted some formidable Catholic leaders like John Ryan, who urged his fellow clergy to be very clear and persistent in arguing very forcefully for the moral law against contraception and for enforcing the laws against it. You know, of course, you all know Ryan's ethics included support for social justice and labor rights, as well as opposition to race suicide, which was a term that had been popularized by Theodore Roosevelt in warning Americans that the fertility rate of immigrants was outpacing that of white Anglo-Saxons, and so for white people to use birth control was to risk the extinction of the white race. Ryan and other Catholic leaders clearly meant to call attention to just the greater hazard of reducing the population of those who Ryan's fellow Jesuit M.P. Dowling called those who are in a position to rear sturdy sons and daughters who are best fitted to be the bulwark of the nation, the privileged classes, end quote. So these were common views, and not only among Protestants. These are Catholic leaders then, too. So to these Catholics, for a whole variety of reasons, Sanger was steering the nation to race suicide. Indeed, in the minds of some of these clerics, she was encouraging women to be selfish and materialistic in refusing to bear as many children as God would send. And as Sanger realized that Catholic leaders could be a potent enemy to her cause, she also began to recognize how successful she could be in rallying American anti-Catholicism against the Catholic Church. And I won't take time to detail that whole story here, but part of the story of that early birth control movement is Sanger's very, very successful harnessing of Protestant anti-Catholicism against Catholic efforts to, in essence, put a halt to her movement. So at stake, there were a lot of issues at stake in this issue, obviously. Again, women's rights, eugenics, immigration policy, all different types of things. But it was also rival convictions about human liberty and autonomy and freedom. Catholic leaders despised Sanger, again, because they believed she sought to destroy the ties of love between mother and child, husband and wife, church and person. And Sanger, for her part, detested the Catholic hierarchy because she believed it sought to control not only the thought of and behavior of faithful Catholics, but also the laws and culture and people of the United States much more broadly. So each position was galvanizing for its own constituency and, of course, created a profound division that remains with us still. Now, let me move up a few decades to another great controversy driving this story, and when we have our Q&A, I'd be happy to fill in some of the blanks here of the intervening decades. I'm going to jump to 1961, when the Canadian and National Councils of Churches, Protestant groups, convened the first North American Conference on Church and Family at Green Lake, Wisconsin. Over 500 delegates came to this conference. They represented 33 Protestant denominations, 57 states and provinces. And for about 5 days running, participants presented a wide range of research and talked about what the problems of the day were relating to marriage and the education of the youth. And out of that meeting, a number of Protestant denominations began to increase efforts to produce sex education curricula for children and teens. These weren't isolated efforts limited to the churches. There were wider concerns in the culture about, what we came to be called the sexual revolution. Books like The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl, all kinds of things began coming out, Playboy magazine, and caused a great deal of alarm in the wider culture. Meanwhile, liberal Protestants were beginning to act on behalf of gay rights and working to repeal sodomy statutes, among other things, and this received a wide attention in both religious and the secular press. All of these changes generated tremendous anxiety, and an important result of that anxiety generated by all of these changes was a widespread debate over sex education, a need, a sort of shared agreement that better sex education for youth needed to be created and implemented somehow. Deep disagreement over where that should happen and what such programs should look at. So, as educators and professionals across many fields began to look for ways to solve social problems that they perceived to be erupting because of shifting sexual standards, many people agreed that the public schools must play an important role in this effort. So sex education programs began to proliferate by the mid-1960s, and again, this was a wave as powerful as it was divisive. So for some people, they believed that school-imparted information could be a tremendous help, that parents weren't doing enough in the home to educate their own children. Others saw this as a deeply problematic attempt to wrest the educational effort away from the family and put it in a place it did not belong, which was government, taxpayer-funded public schools. One of the most important organizations in that period to help implement these programs was an organization called the Sex Information and Education Council of the United States. The acronym is SIECUS, S-I-E-C-U-S, which was founded in 1964 by the Quaker physician Mary Steichen Calderon. Calderon was a devout Quaker, practicing Quaker, and she had been at that Green Lake conference working with a lot of the clergy who were there. Calderon was a very close collaborator with many Protestant clergy pioneering in this field and some Catholic clergy as well while they were still involved in this effort. You could almost see SIECUS as a Christian organization itself. And under Calderon's leadership, SIECUS made enormous inroads in school systems across the country, efforts for which it was both applauded and excoriated. Now, I want to say Calderon she was a revolutionary in terms of these long labors on behalf of birth control, access, and sex education, but she was really a conservative in terms of what she believed sex education should all be about. She was no fan, as she said many times, of casual sex and the sexual revolution. She really believed sex education was ultimately for the purpose of strengthening stable families and permanent relationships, which would sustain society. She was ambivalent about homosexuality. She openly sort of discussed her unclear beliefs. She came to be quite pro-LGBT by the end of her life, but that was not the case in the 1960s. So her goal was really to enable kids of all ages to be honest about their bodies and their questions and their fears about sex and sexuality, and to have really factual, helpful, ethical information about the consequences of acting heedlessly on desires. So I just say this to say there was a conservative sort of push behind Calderon there. However, nonetheless, the embrace of sex education at the local level, which happened really rapidly in the 1960s, I think there almost 50% of public school districts by about 1966 had some version, some form of sex education, and this prompted a severe backlash and numerous local battles. And as Sikas's role in all of this became widely known, opposition to that organization and to Calderon personally grew fierce. The two groups in particular who collaborated often during the 1960s had the most significant opposition, and these were the John Birch Society, which was founded as an anti-communist conservative advocacy organization in 1958, and the Christian Crusade of Billy James Hargis, who was an influential fundamentalist evangelist and also John Bircher himself. Both of these bodies were really instrumental in this conflict, but the Christian Crusade's focus on sex education was really central and very, very powerful. And the Christian Crusade proved a really formidable challenge to Calderon's own crusade for sexual truth. So Christian Crusade over the next several years helped to foment a real wave of controversies in a lot of different school districts over sex ed in local communities, most famously perhaps in Anaheim, California, where public schools had incorporated a program since 1965, but also generated some of the fiercest opposition to that. Hargis and his partners played a really critical role in demonizing Calderon as an enemy to children, to the family, and ultimately to the nation. And in very elaborate ways managed to stoke tremendous fear, I think, of the national controversies and sort of, the dangers and the risks of sex education, and someone like Calderon herself and the liberal Protestants around her who were also supporting these programs. So sex education, the main part of the controversies had died out by the early 70s, but of course they've continued in school districts around the country even to this day. Finally, I want to look at one of the most critical issues dividing us today, an issue really splitting much of the nation today, and that is sexual harassment. Now, you'll remember from last December that when Al Franken resigned from the Senate after 8 women accused him of making unwanted sexual advances, he bitterly noted, and this is a quote from him, "The irony in the fact that I am leaving while a man who has bragged on tape about his history of sexual assaults sits in the Oval Office, and a man, Roy Moore, who has repeatedly preyed on young girls, campaigns for the Senate with the full support of his party." And indeed, Donald Trump remains president of the United States, and while many Republicans did denounce Roy Moore last year, he carried the full backing of the White House. And I don't need to remind you, we have had one after another sexual harassment scandals since then. So we've been plunged once more into a national debate over sex, power, assault, and morality. And a lot of folks have hoped this would finally be the watershed moment for a full reckoning. But I'm here to tell you we've been here before, and we've seen some of these hopes fade and get overtaken, and they get overtaken by self-interested partisan political fights over and over again, and it's happening again. So going back to the fall of 1991, remember, the nation was then transfixed by the confirmation hearings of the African-American jurist Clarence Thomas, whom the first President Bush had nominated to be Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. Anita Hill's credible allegations of sexual harassment threatened to derail his nomination. She was subpoenaed. She appeared before the committee on October 11th. Thomas vigorously denied the charges and called the proceedings a high-tech lynching, which is one of the most famous, I think, remembered quotes from that hearing. And millions of Americans weighed in and fiercely debated, of course, which party was telling the truth. That's 1991. 2.5 years later, sexual harassment allegations again rocked American politics, and this time, of course, they involved the new president of the United States, Bill Clinton. Paula Jones, who had been an employee of the state of Arkansas, filed a lawsuit in May of 1994, alleging that Clinton, while he was governor of Arkansas, had commanded Jones to be brought to his hotel room during a state-sponsored conference. I'll just say he behaved abominably, according to her account, and attempted to persuade her to perform sexual acts before she escaped, shocked and shaken. So once again, Americans were treated to explicit details of alleged sexual encounters and this bitter he said, she said exchange over the truth. And once again, Americans expressed strikingly polarized views toward a woman who was asserting actionable mistreatment by a prominent government official. These scandals produced utterly polarized and often sensationalized storylines about each protagonist. They drew on stereotypes about wanton women and black hypersexuality, victimization plot lines that sympathizers were eager to believe. And, you know, whatever the facts in either of these cases, and none of the charges were definitively proven in either, and yet both seem credible to many observers. But both of these cases expanded the nation's interest in sexual harassment and fostered discussion of women's rights, workplace boundaries, and the reach of the law. But far from uniting us, Americans, in a shared commitment to dignity for female workers, say, the events resulted in an intensely partisan discussion that produced no shared understanding of the facts, and that is with us still. So, you know, essentially, and if you look at the religious dimensions of this, which I've tried to lay out in the book, you see especially Christians themselves, on the conservative evangelical side in particular, dramatically switching sides, rallying very strongly to Thomas's defense during the Anita Hill trial, and then Christian legal organizations actually supported Paula Jones's entire lawsuit on the Clinton side. Now, maybe they just had a change of heart about the importance of sexual harassment. That is certainly possible, but it may just be religion, sex, and politics. It looks to me awfully partisan, the sorts of reasons, and this was of course true on the liberal side too, that the liberal Protestants really supported Anita Hill, you know, in all kinds of ways over and over again, and then were very silent on the Paula Jones case. We're sort of having a bit of a reckoning around that right now, but I don't think it's been all that deep. So you once again see the sort of opportunism that I think maybe most of us maybe have become sort of prone to when it comes especially to these issues, I think, around sex and sexual morality and women's rights. So it's no wonder that our current debates over sexual harassment, whether we're talking Donald Trump, Al Franken, Roy Moore, or Brett Kavanaugh, that these two have been riven by political interests. And all of this suggests to me, again, that the reckoning still has not come. There we are in this moment in time. So just to conclude, here we are nearly a century after American women gained the right to vote and fought successfully for the right to speak publicly about contraception without fear of arrest. And yet, our nation's colossal clash over gender and sexuality is as live as it has ever been. This was extremely visible in the 2016 presidential campaign battle between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. I know I don't need to remind you how the religious vote split on that one, and that was for a whole host of reasons, no doubt. But it absolutely included decades-old misogyny-tinged hatred of Clinton and the lure of a particular type of male authority. Again, I'm not saying it's all that, but that was definitely a factor there in those campaign battles. So it would be naive to imagine that Christians across the spectrum, much less Americans more broadly, that we can return to any kind of a consensus regarding sex and gender. And it's impossible to imagine what that could possibly look like. So widespread agreement on these issues seems pretty hopeless, and common ground is difficult to find. I think, for one thing, to recognize and acknowledge the fears that are animating citizens across a broad ideological spectrum. While it's no quick fix for our politics, it is a necessary start. The kind of fears that get stoked by certain opportunistic, perhaps, political leaders over and over again about the dire consequences that will supposedly befall us if this group gets full and equal rights, or women, LGBT people, whatever. So the kinds of fears and the ways that those take hold, I think, are really crucial to think about together. A kind of glue that once held us all together, very problematically to be sure, but this has been dissolving for a century. And finding a way for us to live together, despite our very deep differences, demands participation in a larger project of reckoning, engaging, and willfully empathizing with others in our common humanity, so as to rouse a fractured nation to build a bearable peace. And all of us reckoning with our own deepest prejudices, fears, and conflicts concerning race, also gender, sexuality, and much, much else besides, is a necessary task toward that end. So thank you. Stop there.